Alrighty, what is up, everyone, and welcome back to another one of Ronin's movie reviews, where today we're tackling the entire first season of SpongeBob. There is a lot we have to get into, so I won't waste too much time with an introduction. However, I will say many people consider this to be the best era of SpongeBob. And I'm looking forward to see how true that is. So without further ado, let's dive into this review. Starting with the first episode, titled Reef Blower. The synopsis of the episode is as follows: a shell toss from Squidward's lawn lets SpongeBob test out his new high powered reef blower. Let's begin with what I liked about the episode, starting with how much I love the way the old episodes used to look. The episode having no verbal dialogue is very effective. And finally, I really enjoyed that the episode was very short and to the point. The only thing I didn't like about the episode was the random subtitle. It really ruined what the episode was going for. I think the episode was just pretty alright. I give the episode a 7 out of 10. Moving on to the next episode, titled Tea at the Tree Dome. The synopsis of the episode is as follows: Sandy invites SpongeBob to her airfield. The synopsis of the episode is as follows: Sandy invites SpongeBob to her air-filled tree dome. Let's start with what I liked about the episode, beginning with how much I love the way the old episodes used to look. The music in the episode was excellent. SpongeBob and Sandy's dynamic is just so fun. Patrick screaming Pinky is one of those moments in SpongeBob that never fails to make me laugh. And finally, there's a moment that never fails to make me laugh, and it's Patrick screaming, "What kind of place is this?" For those of you who watch SpongeBob, or for those of you who just enjoy memes, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Now, let's move over to what I liked. No, not sorry. Sorry. Let's move over to what I didn't like, starting with the way SpongeBob looks when he doesn't have water. It never fails to make me cringe. Sandy is supposed to be one of the smartest creatures in the show, but didn't know that SpongeBob needed water, and that's absolutely ridiculous. And really feels like an oversight by the creators. And finally, a thing that bothered me is why did Sandy put ice in the water in the vase? It just didn't make any sense to me. All things considered, I give that episode a solid 8 out of 10. It was a great introduction to Patrick and Sandy. Moving on to the next episode, titled Bubble Stand. The synopsis of this episode is as follows: for just 25 cents a lesson, SpongeBob introduces Patrick and Squidward to the fine art of bubble blowing. Let's begin with what I liked about the episode, starting with the way the bubble technique was animated, and finally, Patrick calling an elephant a giraffe will never fail to make me laugh. The only thing I didn't like about the episode was Patrick's constant laughing. It was so damn annoying. With that being said, I give the episode a 9 out of 10. Moving on to the next episode, titled Rip Pants. The synopsis is as follows: SpongeBob tries to impress Sandy and rips his pants. Let's begin with what I liked, starting with the sandcastle art SpongeBob was doing in the beginning. It was really fun and creative. And finally, the music number in this was an absolute banger. The only thing I didn't like about the episode was the fact that the rip pants joke was so annoying. It was funny the first two times, but after that, it was just so damn annoying and overdone. All in all, I thought it was a solid episode. I'll give it a 9 out of 10. Moving on to the next episode, titled Jellyfishing. The synopsis is as follows: Squidward tries to survive SpongeBob and Patrick's attempt to make his best day ever. Let's start with what I liked, starting with how much I love the concept of jellyfishing in SpongeBob. Squidward not knowing Patrick's name is so funny. Squidward getting into a bicycle accident is so ridiculous, yet is so well executed. Patrick had so many great moments in this episode, and this is the episode where Patrick says firmly grasp it. Now, for those of you who watch SpongeBob or you meme lords out there, you know exactly what I'm talking about, and you know exactly how funny it is. There was surprisingly nothing I didn't like about this episode. So, with that being said, I give this episode a 10 out of 10. Let's move on to the next episode, which is titled Plankton. The synopsis of this episode is as follows: Plankton takes control of SpongeBob's brain. Let's start with what I liked, starting with the really fun scene of Mr. Krabs putting Plankton on a plate and throwing him back to the chum bucket like a frisbee. Plankton pulled a golden spatula out of his ass, and no, I'm not joking, but it was absolutely hilarious. There was an entire scene where Plankton stops making his way to the Krusty Krab to turn around and insult Squidward. And if that's not D1 hating, I don't know what is. Let's move on to sorry. Sorry about that. Let's move over to what I didn't like, starting with the disgusting scene of SpongeBob making a Krabby Patty by putting the ingredients inside of his body. SpongeBob's laugh is absolutely horrible and I hate hearing it. And finally, something that has always bothered me about Plankton is that he can create these incredibly genius inventions, such as a robot computer wife. God damn, I can't speak. But somehow still hasn't gotten his hands on a Krabby Patty. With that being said, I give this episode a 5 out of 10. Let's move on to the next episode titled Naughty Nautical Neighbors. The synopsis of this episode is as follows: Squidward tricks SpongeBob and Patrick into believing they're no longer friends. Let's start with what I liked, starting with Squidward immediately getting his karma for ruining SpongeBob and Patrick's friendship. I'm not going to say how he gets his karma because I'm not sure if I can, but just look up the Squidward fork scene from the episode and you'll understand. There is a detail when Squidward passes out where his eyes go from the usual horizontal like things to saying KO, and that's such a fun cartoon detail. And finally, Patrick was also just making me laugh for the entire episode. Shout out to the best character in the damn show. The only thing I didn't like was, once again, SpongeBob's laugh. It ruined this episode. Not ruined entirely, but it ruined parts of it. I give this episode an 8 out of 10. Let's move on to the next episode titled Boating School. The episode synopsis is as follows: SpongeBob and Patrick devise a plan to help SpongeBob pass his boating test. Finally. Let's start with what I liked, starting with the hilarious scene of a guy telling SpongeBob he doubts that SpongeBob will get his license. I say random guy because I'm pretty sure they never gave the guy a name. I could be wrong, and if I am, please let me know down in the comments. I love the running gag of SpongeBob always failing his boating exam. Another thing I love is how Mrs. Puff puts on two seatbelts and a helmet when she has to be in the boat during SpongeBob's exam. There's a really fun compilation of SpongeBob completing his boating exam. Patrick was once again just being Patrick and never failing to make me laugh. And finally, the My Leg guy makes an appearance. That's another one of those gags that I'll just never get tired of. Let's move over to what I didn't like, starting with how Patrick is an idiot any other time, but suddenly now he's able to help SpongeBob almost pass his exam. And finally, once again, SpongeBob just had to do that horrid fucking laugh. With that being said, I give this episode a 7 out of 10. Now, let us move on to the next episode, Pizza Delivery. The synopsis of this episode is as follows: SpongeBob and Squidward deliver the first ever Krusty Krab pizza. Let's start with what I liked, starting with how much I loved Mr. Krabs' character just being greedy. It's always funny and fun to watch. SpongeBob and Squidward had such a fun dynamic in this episode, and finally, I'm giving this episode points for the iconic Krusty Krab pizza song. Let's move on to what I didn't like, starting with the mishandling of the Krusty Krab pizza. I'm only taking points off because it was mishandled the entire episode, and when they deliver it to the customer, it's in good condition. With that being said, I give this episode a 6 out of 10. Let's move on to the next episode titled Home Sweet Pineapple. The episode synopsis is as follows: Nematodes devour SpongeBob's house. Let's start with what I liked, starting with the sound effects of the episode. They're very well done. The voice acting really comes through in this episode. The voice actors really brought their A game. I'm giving this episode points for Patrick once again being the best character, and finally, SpongeBob and Patrick's dynamic in this episode was perfect. Let's start with what I didn't like, starting with the scene where SpongeBob and Patrick are sleeping under Patrick's rock. And finally, I'm taking away Sorry, I started reading the wrong paragraph. The only thing I didn't like about this episode was the scene where SpongeBob and Patrick are sleeping under Patrick's rock. I'm taking points away from this. Nah, I'm only taking points away for this because the animators animate the underneath. Sorry, gosh, I cannot speak in this video. The only thing I didn't like was the scene where SpongeBob and Patrick are sleeping under Patrick's rock. I'm only taking points away from this because the animators animate the underneath, the under, the under. Gosh, you guys are going to roast me down in the comments for this. The only thing I didn't like was the scene where SpongeBob and Patrick are sleeping under Patrick's rock. I'm only taking points away from this because the animators just animate underneath Patrick's rock however they see fit. Sometimes it's flat, and other times he has an entire area he can walk around in. With that being said, I give this episode a 6 out of 10 as well. Let's move on to the next episode titled Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy. The synopsis of the episode is as follows: SpongeBob and Patrick try to lure their favorite television superheroes out of retirement. Let's begin with what I liked, starting with Mermaid Man's voice actor. He was really giving it his all. He was really giving it his all with his voice acting performance. I'm giving this episode points for the random live action clip. It was funny and had perfect comedic timing. Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy had amazing chemistry in this episode. And finally, I'm also going to give this episode points for genuinely being funny. The only thing I didn't like about this episode was SpongeBob and Patrick's dynamic. They were incredibly annoying in this episode. Side note, before I get into my final verdict for the episode, I would love a Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy spinoff show. That's a show that SpongeBob and Patrick actually watch. There's so much potential for it, and it's criminal that we haven't gotten something like that yet. With that out of the way, I give this episode a 7 out of 10. Let's move on to the next episode, titled Pickles. The episode synopsis is as follows: SpongeBob loses his confidence after Bubble Bass says there are no pickles on his Krabby Patty. Let's start with what I liked, starting with the voice acting. Everyone brought their A game for this episode. The episode does a great job conveying what self doubt is like. I love the entire scene of Squidward working the grill because he didn't know what he was doing and was absolutely burning everything. And finally, SpongeBob exposing Bubble Bass as a liar was incredibly satisfying. The only thing I didn't like about the episode was Bubble Bass's annoying laugh. I thought SpongeBob's laugh was bad, but Bubble Bass's is absolutely horrid. With that being said, I give this episode a 7 out of 10 as well. Let's move on to the next episode titled Hall Monitor. The synopsis of the episode is as follows: it's SpongeBob's turn as Hall Monitor, but why stop at the school halls when there's a big city to watch over? Let's begin with what I liked, starting with the Hall Monitor outfit. The purple and blue look very good on SpongeBob. I'm giving this episode points for the my leg joke. I've said it once and I'll say it again. It'll never get old. And finally, Patrick, once again, was the star of the show. I just fucking love Patrick. There wasn't anything I didn't like about the episode. So with that being said, I give this episode a 10. Another one of those rare, perfect episodes, in my opinion. Let's move on over to the next episode titled Jellyfish Jam. The synopsis of the episode is as follows: SpongeBob takes home a wild jellyfish. Let's begin with what I liked, starting with the music in this episode. The music is so unbelievably good. The dance montage in the episode was also so incredibly well done. And finally, there is a scene where the jellyfish turns SpongeBob into a disco ball, and it's one of the funniest things that happen in SpongeBob. The only thing I didn't like about the episode was the music. Uh, the music. It's undeniable. Sorry, I can't speak. The only thing I didn't like about the episode was the music. It's undeniably good. However, it got incredibly annoying after hearing it for as long as I had to. Before I give you the final review score, I wanted to share a fun fact. When I was in first grade, my teacher showed us this episode as a music lesson. That's all. That's literally just a fact. With that out of the way, I give this episode a 6 out of 10. Let's move on to the next episode titled Sandy's Rocket. The episode synopsis is as follows: SpongeBob and Patrick accidentally launch Sandy's rocket ship and go slightly off course. Let's begin with what I liked, starting with SpongeBob and Patrick's dynamic. Their dynamic tends to be really good whenever they're together, and in this episode, it's no exception. I'm also going to give this episode points for Patrick once again being the best character in this show. I love the way the inside of Sandy's rocket looks. I also love the spacesuits that SpongeBob and Patrick wear. And finally, I'm going to give this episode points for actually making me laugh out loud. The only thing I didn't like about the episode was how much SpongeBob annoys me. As a kid, I used to think he was funny, but now that I'm older, he just overstimulates the fuck out of me, and I don't like that. With that being said, I give this episode a 6 out of 10. Let's move on to the next episode titled SpongeBob's Squeaky Boots. The synopsis of this episode is as follows: Mr. Krabs tricks SpongeBob into buying a worthless pair of fry cook boots. Let's start with what I liked, starting with how funny it is that instead of counting sheep, Mr. Krabs counts money. The voice acting is really well done, and finally, the animation is so incredibly well done. The only thing I didn't like it about the episode was the squeaking noise. It's so incredibly annoying and it goes on far too long. With that being said, I give this episode yet another 6 out of 10. Let's move on to the next episode titled Nature Pants. The episode synopsis is as follows: SpongeBob takes off to jellyfish fields to live amongst the jellyfish. Let's start with what I liked, starting with Patrick once again being the star of the show. I'm giving points to this episode for making me laugh out loud. I'm going to give this episode points for the really fun animations. And finally, I'm going to give the epic bonus points. Wait, hold on. Sorry. And finally, I'm going to give the episode bonus points. I'm going to give the episode bonus points for Squidward finally making me laugh. Let's move on to what I didn't like, starting with how much it bothers me that there's running water in the ocean, and what bothers me even more is that there are things catching on fire on the seafloor. And finally, I hate that I had to watch SpongeBob run around with nothing but socks and shoes for most of the episode. With that being said, I give this episode a 6 out of 10. A lot of these episodes have been getting sixes, and I'm hoping it's going to get better from here, but I know how it's going to go, but you don't. Let's move on to the next episode titled Opposite Day. Let's move on to the next episode titled Opposite Day. The synopsis is as follows. Squidward declares it opposite day, so SpongeBob and Patrick will act normal. Ha! Let's start with what I liked, starting with the amazing birthday song by SpongeBob and Patrick. I want to give points to the voice actors because they really brought their A game yet again. Um, yeah, I'm giving points to this episode for Patrick once again being the best character in the show. I absolutely love the compilation of SpongeBob and Patrick doing opposite day stuff. And finally, SpongeBob and Patrick pretending to be Squidward is the funniest shit ever. The only thing I didn't like about the episode was how much I hate SpongeBob's laugh. That's the one thing that's probably never going to change. That's all I didn't like, really. With that being said, I give the episode a 7 out of 10. Let's move on to the next episode titled Culture Shock. The episode synopsis is as follows. It's talent night at the Krusty Krab, and the night's hit is SpongeBob mopping up after performers. Let's start with what I like, starting with how much I love the music in this show. I don't say it enough, but it's really good. I'm going to give this episode points for making Mr. Krabs' greediness over the top and hilarious. I'm giving this episode points for the my leg joke. I know I say it over and over again, but it will never get old. And finally, I'm giving this episode bonus points for Patrick yet again being the star of the show. The only thing I didn't like was how much Squidward was pissing me off the entire time. With that being said, I give this episode an 8 out of 10. Let's move on to the next episode titled FUN. The synopsis of the episode is as follows. SpongeBob believes Plankton is evil because he has no friends, so off the jellyfish fields they go. Let's start with what I liked, starting with the voice acting. Everyone has once again brought their A game. I'm giving points to the episode for the fun song because it's goated, and finally, Plankton and SpongeBob had great chemistry. There wasn't anything I didn't like about the episode. With that being said, I give this episode a 10 out of 10, making it yet another perfect episode. Let's move on to the next episode titled Muscle Bob Buff Pants. The synopsis is as follows. When SpongeBob orders fake muscles, he fools everyone until Sandy enters them both in an anchor throwing contest. Let's start with what I liked, starting with how much I loved the commercial for the anchor arms. I loved the visual of SpongeBob's arms being so long he has to use them to walk instead of his feet. And finally, I have to give the episode points for actually making me laugh. Let's move on to what I didn't like, starting with how much I hated the visual of buff SpongeBob. If you've ever seen it, if you've never seen it, I need you to look it up. I'm taking points away for SpongeBob's TV being in his bedroom. His TV is never in his bedroom, but because the plot demands it, it's in his room now. And finally, there's a big plot hole in the episode that bothers me. Um, Because how did no one notice SpongeBob's muscles were fake? Like, how didn't they notice sooner? The commercial for the fake muscles literally airs on TV, so there's no way that all of the residents of Bikini Bottom didn't know he was blowing hot air. With that being said, I give this episode a 3 out of 10, making it the lowest ranked episode in this video so far. Let's move on to the next episode titled Squidward the Unfriendly Ghost. The synopsis is as follows: SpongeBob and Patrick think they've killed Squidward, so Squidward's ghost takes advantage of the situation. Let's start with what I liked, starting with Patrick yet again being the best character in this damn show. I'm giving this episode bonus points for SpongeBob and Patrick's chemistry in this episode. And finally, I have to give this episode points for once again making me laugh out loud. Let's move on to what I didn't like, starting with how much I hated that SpongeBob and Patrick couldn't tell that the Patrick sorry. I apologize. Let's move on to what I didn't like, starting with how much I hated the fact that SpongeBob and Patrick couldn't tell that the Squidward that they quote unquote killed was a wax figure. And finally, Squidward was just pissing me off in this episode, just like he does almost all the time. People say that when they get older, they can relate to SpongeBob more. I have to call bullshit on that because I'm older and I still can't relate to Squidward. With that being said, I give this episode a 6 out of 10. Let's move on to the next episode titled The Chaperone. The synopsis of the episode is as follows: when Pearl is stood up for when Pearl is stood up when Pearl is stood up for her prom, it's SpongeBob to the rescue. Let's start with what I liked about the episode, starting with how much I loved Mr. Krabs' character in this episode. He was genuinely being such a great dad for Pearl, and it was really nice to watch. SpongeBob trying to make sure that Pearl had a good prom actually made me like his character in this episode, and the Sponge song is an absolute fucking banger, and I'll live by that. Let's move on to what I didn't like, starting with the visual issues. There's a few scenes in this episode that are just incredibly blurry. And finally, Pearl was really just pissing me off the entire time. With that being said, I give this episode a 6 out of 10. Let's move on to the next episode titled Employee of the Month. The synopsis of the episode is as follows. Will Squidward upset SpongeBob 226-month reign as Employee of the Month? Let's start with what I liked, starting with how amazing SpongeBob and Squidward chemistry was in this episode. This episode actually got me the laugh a few times, and the way SpongeBob and Squidward were sabotaging each other were really creative. The only thing I didn't like about this episode was how annoying SpongeBob was. So, with that being said, I give this episode a 7.5 out of 10. Let's move on to the next episode titled Scaredy Pants. The synopsis is as follows. SpongeBob, tired of being known as SpongeBob Scaredy Pants, attempts to conquer his fear and become the scariest person in Bikini Bottom for Halloween. Let's start with what I liked, starting with how much I love the atmosphere in this episode. I can't really explain it, but check out the episode and you'll understand what I mean. SpongeBob and Patrick had amazing chemistry as always. I'm also going to give this episode points for Patrick once again being the best damn character in this episode, or this show in general. And finally, this was another one of those episodes that got a laugh out of me, so I have to give it points for that. Let's move on to what I didn't like, starting with how much it bothers me that fire can be started underwater. There was some horrible voice acting in this episode, and finally, I'm taking away points for Pearl once again pissing me the fuck off. With that being said, I give this episode yet another 6 out of 10. Let's move on to the next episode, titled I Was a Teenage Gary. The synopsis of the episode is as follows. When SpongeBob and Squidward are accidentally infected with snail serum, Gary gets two new playmates. Let's start with what I liked, starting with Patrick once again being the best character in this show. I know I've said this like 7 times already, but he's just one of those characters that never fails to make me laugh. This episode wasn't full of emotion. Um, this episode was full of emotion. The voice actors really put in that work. And finally, I really enjoyed the snail designs for SpongeBob and Squidward. Let's move on to what I didn't like, starting with how much I hate the gross close-ups in this show. The one of Gary in this episode wasn't too bad, however, it was gross. The fact that the fact that Squidward didn't take care of Gary at all weekend, and just neglected him really pissed me off as a pet owner. And finally, having to hear SpongeBob say meow so many times was one of the most annoying things I've ever experienced. With that being said, I give this episode a 5 out of 10. Let's move on to the next episode titled SB129. The synopsis of the episode is as follows: Squidward learns that in the future everything is chrome. Let's begin with what I liked. Starting with the title card change, it was nice to see something that wasn't sand. I really enjoyed the chrome look of the future. I have to give this episode points for actually making me laugh. And finally, I need to express how much I love the looks of the caveman versions of SpongeBob and Patrick. Let's move on to what I didn't like, starting with the gross close-up. The gross. Sorry, goodness gracious. Let's move on to what I didn't like, starting with the gross close-up of Patrick's teeth, and finally, the episode had a few blurry scenes. With that being said, I give this episode a 7 out of 10. Let's move on to the next episode titled Karate Choppers. The episode synopsis is as follows: SpongeBob and Sandy's constant karate sparring may cost SpongeBob his job. Let's begin with what I liked, starting with how much I loved the karate gear. It's a simple yet effective design. Every single scene of SpongeBob and Sandy sparring is so creative. You can tell that the animators had a lot of fun with this episode. I am once again giving this episode points for the my leg joke. I said it before and I'll say it again. It'll never get old. And finally, SpongeBob and Sandy had incredible chemistry this episode. The only thing I didn't like about this episode was there were unfortunately a few blurry scenes. But with that being said, I give the episode an 8 out of 10. Let's move on to the next episode titled Sleepy Time. The synopsis is as follows: SpongeBob can suddenly enter the dreams of others. That's it. That's literally the synopsis. Let's start with what I liked, starting with how much I love seeing the other characters' dreams. They're all so well crafted and feel so on brand for all of the characters. I'm giving points to this episode for Patrick once again being the best character in this damn show. I also got to give points to the voice cast, who all brought their A game. And finally, this episode did the my leg joke, so you just know it's getting points for that. The only thing I didn't like about the episode was the fact I had to see SpongeBob's bare feet. With that being said, I give this episode an 8. Quick side note before we move on to the next episode: I really feel like this episode needs a part 2. I would love to see so many other characters' dreams. Let's move on to the next episode titled Suds. The synopsis is as follows: SpongeBob comes down with a nasty case of the suds. Let's begin with what I liked, starting with how much I really liked the design of SpongeBob with the suds. He actually looks sick. This episode did the my leg joke, so you already know I'm giving it points for that. You also know that I'm giving this episode points for Patrick being the best character in this show, like always. SpongeBob and Patrick once again had amazing chemistry. I have to give this episode even more points for getting a laugh out of me. And finally, I love the live action segments of this episode. Let's move on to what I didn't like, starting with the really gross animations of SpongeBob when he sneezes. And finally, I hate that I had to see Patrick smear peanut butter on SpongeBob's feet. That was gross. You can't tell me that that wasn't done purposeful, that somebody didn't want to animate that. With that being said, I give this episode a 7 out of 10. Let's move on to the next episode titled Valentine's Day. The synopsis is as follows: SpongeBob spreads the love across Bikini Bottom. Let's begin with what I liked, starting with SpongeBob and Patrick once again having amazing chemistry. I'm giving this episode points for Patrick once again being the best damn character in this show. Watching Patrick crash out was genuinely the funniest thing that happened this season. I gotta give points to this episode for having me laugh out loud as well. Let's move on to what I didn't like, starting with how annoying it was having to hear and watch Patrick assume every little thing was his Valentine's gift from SpongeBob. The joke got really stale after the third time. And finally, to make matters even worse, when Patrick's gift was thought to be destroyed, SpongeBob gives Patrick a handshake and tells him that's his gift instead of being honest with his best friend. What kind of best friend does something like that? With that being said, I give this episode a 5 out of 10. Let's move on to the next episode titled The Paper. The synopsis of the episode is as follows: SpongeBob turns an ordinary piece of paper into a gold mine of entertainment. Let's begin with what I liked, starting with SpongeBob and Squidward's chemistry in this episode. They're a really fun duo to watch. And finally, I have to give the animators credit for being so creative with a piece of paper. Let's move on to what I didn't like, and let's begin with what I didn't like. There's a uh, sorry, I am so sorry. I don't know what is going on with me during this recording. But let's move on to what I didn't like, starting with the few blurry scenes in the episode. SpongeBob's grating laugh once again makes an appearance in this episode. Not only is SpongeBob's laugh ear grating, his voice in this episode was really getting to me. And finally, I hate that I had to see Squidward without a shirt. It was just weird, uncanny. With that being said, I give this episode a 4 out of 10. Let's move on to the next episode titled Arg. The synopsis of the episode is as follows. After Mr. Krabs convinces SpongeBob and Patrick to join him on a treasure hunt, the boys discover they're following a board game treasure map. Let's begin with what I liked, starting with how much I love the design of the board game. You probably already know what I'm about to say. However, I'm giving this episode points for Patrick once again being the best character in this show. I'm also giving this episode bonus points for actually making me laugh. The my leg joke is in this episode, and I still find it funny no matter how many times it's done. And finally, the voice actors once again brought their A game for this episode. Let's move on to what I didn't like, starting with how cringe. Sorry. Let's move on to what I didn't like, starting with how much I cringed when SpongeBob and Patrick ate gum from under the table. And finally, this episode had a few blurry scenes. At this point, I'm not sure if it's the DVD or if it's the episode itself. Either way, I'm taking points away for it because it was hard not to notice. With that being said, I give this episode a 6 out of 10. Let's move on to the next episode titled Rock Bottom. The synopsis is as follows. SpongeBob and Patrick accidentally board the wrong bus from Glove World, leading them to a bizarre dark town at the bottom of a cliff called Rock Bottom. After Patrick gets on another bus to go home, he leaves SpongeBob behind. Stranded, SpongeBob tries repeatedly to catch a bus that keeps missing them. Stranded, SpongeBob tries repeatedly to catch a bus but keeps missing them. He finally gives up and waits in a long line at the bus station only to miss the last bus of the night. Let's begin with what I liked, starting with Patrick once again being the best character in this damn show. I really love the designs of the Rock Bottom residents. I also really like the aesthetic of Rock Bottom as a whole. And finally, it was absolutely hilarious watching SpongeBob crash out. Let's move on to what I didn't like, starting with how annoying it was to hear raspberries being blown every 5 seconds. And finally, I really hate the gag of SpongeBob continuously missing the bus. It stopped being funny after the first couple of times. With that being said, I give this episode a 6 out of 10. Let's move on to the next episode titled Texas. The synopsis is as follows. Sandy Cheeks feels homesick for her home state, Texas. After a wave crashes away, a sand sculpture. Sorry. The synopsis is as follows. Sandy Cheeks feels homesick for her home state, Texas. After a wave washes away a sand sculpture she made of it. To cheer her up, SpongeBob and Patrick attempt to bring Texas to her with a makeshift party featuring misguided Texas-themed items. But Sandy insists on returning home. Upon seeing this, her friends throw a real welcome home Texas party at the Krusty Krab, and Sandy decides Bikini Bottom, with its friends who care for her, is her true home and stays. Let's start with what I liked about the episode, starting with the fact that the episode got a laugh out of me. Patrick was once again the best damn character, and finally, this episode had some great voice acting. Let's move on to what I didn't like, starting with the few blurry scenes in this episode. They don't last long, but they're very noticeable. And finally, I really did not like the song that Sandy sung in this episode, like at all. With that being said, I give this episode a 5 out of 10. Let's move on to the next episode titled Walking Small. The synopsis is as follows. Plankton attempts to rid Goo Lagoon. Sorry, oh my god, I can't read for shit. The synopsis is as follows. Plankton attempts to rid Goo Lagoon of beachgoers so he can build a chum bucket mega bucket. Let's begin with what I liked, starting with this show once again getting a laugh out of me. I really like the design of SpongeBob's swim trunks. It's a nice change to his normal outfit, and the simplistic design of the trunks work very well. Plankton was also very well written in this episode, and finally, I'm giving this episode points for the my leg joke. I've said it once, and I'll say it again. It will never get old. Let's move on to what I didn't like, starting with how much I hated watching SpongeBob eat that ice cream cone. If you've seen the episode, you know exactly what I'm talking about. And finally, I'm taking points away for SpongeBob and Plankton's horrid laugh. There was a very awkward up close. Sorry, there was a very awkward close up of SpongeBob that just didn't sit well with me. Hold on. I completely butchered that bit. Give me one moment. Let me redo that section. Let's move on to what I didn't like, starting with how much I hated watching SpongeBob eat that ice cream cone. If you've seen the episode, you know exactly what I'm talking about. I'm taking points away for SpongeBob and Plankton's horrid laugh. SpongeBob's laugh alone is bad, but when you mix him and Plankton's, it goes on for far too long. And finally, there was a very awkward close up of SpongeBob that just didn't sit well with me. So, yeah, I mean, check out the episode to see that close up because it's just weird. With that being said, I give this episode a 5 out of 10. Let's move on to the next episode titled Fools in April. The synopsis is as follows. It's April Fool's Day, and Squidward plays a prank on SpongeBob that's anything but foolish. Let's begin with what I liked, starting with the episode actually getting a laugh out of me. These last few episodes have been getting an ear-to-ear grin out of me. Squidward's prank was very complex and entertaining to watch. The writing for Squidward in this episode was very well done, and finally, Patrick had very few scenes in this episode, but yet again, he was the best damn character in this show. Let's move on to what I didn't like, starting with how quickly I got tired of SpongeBob saying April Fools. I got sick of SpongeBob's laugh after the first few times as well, and finally, the gag where Squidward couldn't bring himself to apologize was overdone. With that being said, I give this episode a 6 out of 10. Let's move on to the next episode titled Neptune's Spatula. The synopsis is as follows. At the Fry Cook Hall of Fame, SpongeBob pulls a mythical spatula from a vat of ancient Greece, giving him claim to the very title of world's greatest fry cook. Let's begin with what I liked, starting with how much I like Patrick's outfit in this episode. They literally just put a shirt and hat on him, but it was such a nice change from the norm. Patrick was once again the best character, even though he had very few scenes. I love when they put random live action scenes into this episode. I love when they put Sorry, oh my goodness. I love when they put random live action scenes into this damn show, and the one they did in this episode got a chuckle out of me. Sorry. And finally, the Fry Cook challenge between SpongeBob and King Neptune was very entertaining to watch. Let's move on to what I didn't like, starting with yet again more blurry scenes. It doesn't last long, it's just hard not to notice. And finally, King Neptune was really pissing me off. I can't stand characters whose whole identity is just being a goddamn asshole. With that being said, I give this episode a 5 out of 10. Let's move on to the next episode titled Hooky. The synopsis is as follows. Patrick introduces SpongeBob to the joys of riding the hooks and free cheese. Let's begin with what I liked, starting with the voice acting once again being absolutely amazing. Patrick was once again the star of the show. The episode was actually funny. It genuinely managed to get a chuckle or two out of me. I really loved the random live action scenes in this episode. They're just perfectly timed. And finally, I love that SpongeBob and Patrick had satisfying consequences for their actions. Let's move on to what I didn't like, starting with the poor video editing. In the first few seconds of the episode, they poorly edited boats on an ocean. And finally, I gotta take points away once again for the random blurry scenes. With that being said, I give this episode a 6 out of 10. Let's move on to the final episode titled Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy 2. The synopsis is as follows. SpongeBob wins the coveted conch signal, allowing him to summon his superheroes day or night. Let's begin with what I liked, starting with how much I loved the stupid news reporting fish. The voice acting in this episode was very well done. This episode was genuinely funny, and finally, there was a very fun compilation of SpongeBob constantly blowing the conch and Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy having to help SpongeBob with random tasks. Like, there was one where they were like giving him a massage or plunging his toilet and fixing his tub. Just funny. The only thing I didn't like about the episode was how genuinely annoying SpongeBob was the entire time. With that being said, I give this episode a 7.5 out of 10. Now, it's time for the moment you've all been waiting for. So, drumroll. I'm not going to make the sound effect. I give SpongeBob Season 1 a 6.5 out of 10, making it just an okay experience. It's not as good as I remember, but it's certainly not bad. I can't recommend watching all of Season 1 or even purchasing it, but if you're looking to just watch an episode or two, it should be fun. But that is going to be it for me for today, everybody. I just want to take a moment to thank each and every one of you for coming out today and watching, liking, commenting, subscribing, all of that. I truly do appreciate it, and your support truly does go a long way. Because without you guys, there truly is no channel. So thank you all so much for that. And with that being said, I hope each and every one of you have a great rest of your day, night, whatever it is for you, and I will see you all in the next content drop.